Welcome to Up Close, the research, opinion and analysis podcast from the University of Melbourne, Australia.
I'm Jennifer Cook. Thanks for joining us. The Republic of Indonesia, with a population of more than 238 million people spread over more than 17,000 islands, it holds claim as one of the more successful functioning and genuinely open multi-party democracies in Asia. Close to 90% of Indonesians are Muslim, yet the country officially embraces a philosophy of religious tolerance and pluralism. It is also among the world's fastest growing emerging economies, a remarkable achievement following the 1997 Asian financial crisis. But Indonesia has undergone huge upheavals following the end of President Suharto's 32-year rule, including changes to the constitution that set out new articles concerning human rights and providing for real freedom of the press. In this episode of Up Close, we take Indonesia's democratic pulse and examine how the right to freedom of expression seems to have been accompanied by a rise in the influence of fundamentalist Islamist groups and a decline in religious pluralism. Professor Tim Lindsey is the Director of the Asian Law Centre here at the University of Melbourne and an Australian Research Council Federation Fellow. He believes that amidst the changing political and social currents in Indonesia, what is going on is no less than a fight within the Islamic community for the future of Islam in that country. He is joined by telephone from Indonesia by Dr. Syafi'i Anwar, the Director of the International Centre for Islam and Pluralism in Jakarta. Syafi'i, a former journalist and editor, was branded a CIA agent and Western puppet by Islamist groups when he spoke up for pluralism in his country. And in 2008, he was beaten and hospitalised during a peaceful demonstration in Jakarta that erupted into a violent brawl of Muslim against Muslim. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Hello.
Now, Tim, can you give us a backdrop to the 2008 Monas demonstration and how it resulted in this Muslim-on-Muslim violence?
What happened to Syafi'i was a demonstration that was organised to support pluralism in Indonesia and in particular to prevent persecution of Ahmadiyya. Ahmadiyya is an Islamic minority sect that believes there was another prophet who came after the Prophet Muhammad, and that's a view that's absolutely unacceptable to most mainstream Muslims. So we now have a conflict between conservative Muslims and this minority group that originates from the Pakistan-India area. Syafi'i was part of a demonstration that was trying to assert tolerance for the Ahmadis and also to support the national ideology Pancasila, which includes the notion of pluralism and tolerance for other religions. Now, what happened was that Syafi'i was, along with other leaders of what you call the moderate or mainstream Muslim community, was attacked brutally by members of Front Pembela Islam, or FPI, as it's commonly called in Indonesia, and was severely injured. But I think he can tell that story better himself.
Well, I was attacked by FPI on June 1, 2008. I was beaten several times by the FBI members when I was participating at the rally organized by National Alliance for Religious Freedom and Belief for commemorating our state ideology Pancasila, as mentioned by Tim. The FBI is one of the radical conservative Islam movement in Indonesia. There are approximately 9 groups of radical conservative Islam in Indonesia. One of them was FPI. FPI was established after the fall of Suharto regime in 1999. It has what we call ideology and, of course, mission to implement Sharia, to replace Pancasila by Sharia. That's the ideology of FPI and any other groups such as Majlis Mujahidin, etc. As a defender of human rights and pluralism, I could not receive demand from FPI to disband Ahmadiyya. Although I myself is not Ahmadiyya member, but as a human rights activist, I have to defend the right to be exist. And when I was beaten several times, one of the attack was reaching my head, so I was hospitalized for 4 days because I was unconscious at the time, and someone was brought me to the hospital.
Must have been terrifying for you, Syafi'i.
Definitely, this is the worst experience I have ever had in my life, in my career as a defender of pluralism, actually. The participants of the rally is approximately 3,000 people, including men, women, and children, actually. Approximately 70 people were injured. From that, approximately 20 people were seriously injured, including I myself.
Syafi'i, I have a question for you. The FPI are behaving like gangsters and criminals, and they are breaking the law. Clearly, they're breaking the ordinary criminal laws in Indonesia. And yet, although there were many police present at the rally, they did not intervene and they did nothing. Why is it that the government isn't prepared to take steps against
that's
FPI?
The problem, actually. It seems to me that the government developed what I call the politics of let the situation take place. In English language, politik pembiaran, let the situation take place. It seems to me that, the government implement what I call indecisive policy regarding FPI. Despite the fact that I was supporter of President FPI, President FPI has a weakness. It seems to me that he's indecisive in making any firm and concise decision related to radical conservative groups.
But the interesting question there is, why is he indecisive?
Yeah, I don't know exactly. Most probably because his Javanese style of leadership, as many observers said, this is also related to political calculation of SPY. But frankly speaking, I don't know exactly what's the problem or factor causing that kind of policy, actually.
Syafi'i, I'd like to ask you, there's more liberal Muslim scholars and researchers in Indonesia. They seek to position Islam as a more tolerant, moderating force in Indonesian society. But how can these relatively liberal ideas be made to reach the masses of Indonesian Muslims? And aren't these liberal scholars and researchers a kind of elite that remain outside mainstream public thought on Islam and society?
Well, that's a very important question, Jen. As a matter of fact, you're right that mostly progressive liberal Islam, they're what I call as a true intellectual leadership. So they just reach mostly middle class and educated Muslim. The problem lies in the fact that tend to be too elitist and too sophisticated in disseminating their idea. So the problem is that ordinary people used to have a simple and more easily understood ideas, but in this regard, the progressive liberal Islam tend to use a sophisticated approach, actually. That's my critical point. However, it is right that we, progressive liberal Islam, are very, very committed to promote moderate and progressive ideas of Islam. But again, we are facing the biggest challenge from the radical conservative Islam. Why? Because we are suspected as the agent of the West, agent of USA, and of course a defender of a Western idea. That's the problem, actually. However, in the future, it would be better if the proponent of moderate and progressive liberal Islam try to use what I call down-to-earth approach, easily understood for the ordinary people, instead of using only intellectual approach. Why? Because ordinary people lack information, lack education, and of course, lacking in understanding Islamic perspective based on the social science, etc. So what we need for the future is to make our ideas easily understood by the ordinary people. In this regard, what I have developed so far is what we call pluralism in action, rather than promoting interfaith dialogue, interfaith talking, etc. Because what we need is to promote not only ideas but also action.
Tim, what do you think this says about a post-Suharto, newly democratised Indonesia?
The most important thing in understanding what happened in Indonesia as regards Islam and democracy after Suharto is actually what happened beforehand. For 32 years under Suharto's new order, political freedoms and in particular religious freedoms were controlled. The New Order government feared political Islam and so prevented public expression of Islamic identity, which became almost subversive. The wearing of Islamic clothes in public places, in offices and so forth were banned. And Islamic political parties were forcibly amalgamated into a party that didn't even have Islam in its name. So after 32 years of repression that at times went as far as killing large numbers of people, every now and then there'd be an incident where the government would remind Islamic agitators what it was prepared to do, shoot some of them. After 32 years of this, the fall of Suharto led to this complete opening up of the Indonesian system. Indonesia went through a rapid democratic transformation that resulted in the introduction of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, almost completely intact, in a new constitution that was put together between 1999 and 2002.
I'm just trying to imagine how these people would have felt after being so repressed. It would have just been like being able to breathe for the first time.
Indeed, and it led to this efflorescence of Islamic culture, Islamic ideas, Islamic politics, Islamic debate, both on the right and on the left. So what you had was Islamic voices of conservatism, radicalism, militancy, but you also had voices of Islamic liberalism, what we call the moderate groups, if you like. So the liberalising, the freeing up of Islam after more than 3 decades of repression led to, yes, public expression of Islamic identity, but also debate about what that identity was like. And that's been seen in mainstream politics, where you have Islamic parties that are really close to being a secular party, which even invite Christians and Hindus as members. And you have other political parties that assert the need to introduce Sharia. Not just in politics, though, also in public life. Islamic costume, do you wear it? Do you don't wear it? If you wear it, what does it mean? And, of course, in the streets, and that includes violent Islamic gangs and Muslims protesting for their freedoms against those gangs.
This is Up Close, coming to you from the University of Melbourne, Australia. I'm Jennifer Cook, and our guests today are Professor Tim Lindsey, the Director of the Asian Law Centre here at the University of Melbourne, and he's joined by Dr. M. Syafi'i Anwar, the Director of the International Centre for Islam and Pluralism. Tim, you mentioned the word Sharia.
Sharia is generally understood as a reference to Islamic law, Islamic legal traditions. It's a contested word. There are many different understandings of what it means, but essentially it means Islamic law. And in Indonesia, the advocates of Sharia want to see Sharia as the key source of legal norms, displacing other sources of legislation. They would like to see traditional interpretations of Islamic fiqh or jurisprudence being enforced by the state. So a lot of this argument about what Islam will be in Indonesia after the end of the new order is actually about what form of Islam the state is prepared to enforce and how far it will go. And what happened at this rally, this demonstration that's been called the Monas tragedy, the National Monument tragedy, was that a group of Muslims who were marching, along with other religious groups, but it was predominantly Muslims, in favour of pluralism and religious tolerance, were attacked by another group of Muslims, that is to say the conservative radical hardliners who are opposed to that level of religious tolerance. But while this was happening, the police were standing by in large numbers and not intervening. And this event became extremely important in Indonesia because it was seen as symbolising what's happening more broadly in Indonesian society, a conflict between the conservative militant hardliners against the liberal progressive moderates over religious tolerance in which the state does not intervene.
You say the Indonesian government's not doing anything, the police aren't doing anything. Now, you have some insight into why you think that may be the case.
Again, it goes back to what used to prevail in Indonesia under the new order prior to 1998, and that was a time when the state sat above civil society and it tightly controlled what went on in the community underneath it. With the fall of Suharto and Indonesia's remarkably successful transition to multi-party democracy, the state's no longer able to control everything. This is no longer a dictatorship. This is a contested, genuine multi-party democracy. So the state finds itself now in the middle between the two groups. This is particularly significant when it comes to Islam because no government in Indonesia since Suharto has been able to win a majority. Every government has been a minority government. And this is true now for President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, now in his second term as president. He has at no stage controlled the legislature. Another important effect of the constitutional amendments that took place after 1999 was to shift power away from the presidency into the hands of the legislature. The legislature is now by far the most powerful institution in Indonesia, although many people still assume it's the presidency. It's not. Now, the president, in order to put policy into concrete form, needs to get laws through that legislature. He doesn't have the numbers. He has about a quarter of the total numbers. He needs to build coalitions and alliances for almost everything he does in the legislature. He is not going to put his head up on the issue of Islam. If he does, he risks having his political opponents use it against him. He risks losing support from the very small Islamic parties within the legislature. And that means, effectively, for the government, the safest policy is to do nothing.
And is it fair to say that the government has a high degree of tolerance when it comes to civil violence?
I once heard President Megawati say that Westerners need to understand that a day never goes past in Indonesia when there isn't somebody attacking somebody over some political issue. And that's because Indonesia, you have to remember, is a nation of nearly 240 million people, and if it was laid across the map of Europe, it would run from Moscow to London. It is a vast archipelago of 17,000 islands with hundreds of ethnic groups and every major world religion represented. And so it's hardly surprising that there are such tensions within the community. Yes, the government does have a high degree of tolerance, in particular now because it would rather see horizontal conflict between religious groups, ethnic groups, political groups directed at each other than vertical conflict against the state itself. And so think about the fact that in Indonesia, despite a common image in the West of a vast military and gigantic armed forces who can control the place, in fact, the military are very small in number, their capacity to maintain order is very limited, and they, in these sort of situations, fear that horizontal violence between religious groups will be directed at the state and the state won't be able to handle it if they intervene. So the easiest solution politically and security terms is for the state to step out of the debate, a debate they feel they can't control in any case, and let it run. Now that explains why it happens, but of course the casualties of this are the weakest members of the community.
Tim, you talk about the effect on minority groups. Could you tell us about the Ahmadi situation?
The Ahmadis are a group who consider themselves to be Muslims, but whom most Orthodox Muslims completely reject as members of that religion. Specifically, they believe that a man called Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, who was born in the late 19th century and lived in the India-Pakistan region, they believe that he was another prophet after Muhammad. And the Orthodox Muslim belief is the prophecy ended with Muhammad. There are no further prophets possible. So this is a point of deep tension between Orthodox Islam and the Ahmadis, who nonetheless consider themselves to be Muslims. Ahmadis have been in Indonesia since the 1920s. They have faced persecution in different countries around the world, but now they are facing it in Indonesia. And their position is particularly difficult because, as I said, in this struggle over the future of Islam and which groups will dominate official interpretations of Islam in Indonesia, because the state tries to keep out of that argument as much as possible to prevent this vertical conflict, the tensions being directed against it, that means that there's a lot of blaming the victims that go on. Now, the Ahmadis are classic victims. They have a position that won't allow them to be absorbed into Islam. They consider themselves to be Muslims, and Orthodox groups see them as absolutely heretical. And this started with complaints, with a series of fatwa being issued by the peak Indonesian Ulama, or Religious Scholars Council in Indonesia, against the Ahmadis in 1980 and again in 2008, and has since grown into civil violence led by hardline vigilante Islamist groups against them. And this most recently, just in February 2011, led to killings of 3 Ahmadis in West Java and riots in a nearby Temanggung. So this has now gone from events such as the attack at the National Monument, where liberal and progressive leaders were injured, to actual, in rural areas, pre-organised, planned vigilante killings of Ahmadis. And the context is not just one of fatwa issued by religious scholar organisations, but now also the government at last being forced to act, and it's had its own deep internal political dilemmas about what it will do. And unfortunately, the decision it made was to blame the victim. What happened was the government, under great pressure from the Orthodox conservative groups, passed a joint ministerial decree which has been extremely unclear in what it says. What it does actually say, when you read the text in its plain words, is that it limited the freedom of the Ahmadis to spread their religion and practice it in an open manner. In other words, to try and convert others to Ahmadi faith or to be seen to be publicly praying and following their rituals. They didn't ban it outright. However, this has been interpreted as a sort of ban, and we now have governments in West Java, East Java and elsewhere passing bans, and that has authorised this vigilante violence. So again, we've got this situation where the government, nervous about turning horizontal into vertical conflict, is reluctant to take a stand on freedom of religion and the basic rights that these minorities have, and that leads to the victims being blamed, but not just blamed, now having their houses burnt, their mosques destroyed and even killed themselves.
I'm Jennifer Cook and you're listening to Up Close, coming to you from the University of Melbourne. I'm talking with Professor Tim Lindsey on the decline of pluralism in Indonesia. Now, Tim, this may seem like a very simple question, but do people in Indonesia, does the average Indonesian person, do they vote along religious lines?
Interestingly, although Indonesia is actually the world's largest Muslim society, there are believed to be more Muslims in Indonesia than the whole of the Middle East, for example. Interestingly, despite that, Muslims in Indonesia have historically not voted for Muslim parties. You can track back through every election that's been held, whether it's been the free elections of the 50s or after Suharto or the rigged elections during Suharto, and people did not give a majority of votes at any time to Muslim parties. In fact, after Suharto, the percentage voting in free and fair elections for Muslim parties has actually declined. People are choosing secular nationalist tradition over Islamic identity. This shouldn't really surprise us. This is a society that is moving from being a developing country towards achieving that middle income status, catching up with Malaysia next door. And in most modern developed societies, people don't vote on the basis of their religion. So we're seeing a transition in Indonesia from communalism towards a real democratic choice. And this, of course, adds to the tensions in Indonesia over the future of Islam. The truth is that the radical conservative Islamist groups realise that they have lost the battle at the ballot box. These tensions aren't because the Conservatives are winning, it's precisely because they are losing in mainstream politics. Their votes have fallen. They have less control. What they do have is a little bit of leverage, and they are maximising the benefit they get from that by using tactics of political wedging, of aggressive militant activity, demonstrations and violence, and just recently tactics such as sending book bombs through the mail to prominent Muslim liberal leaders. They seek to maximise the impact they have. One of the problems about this is they have been quite successful in hijacking both the debate in Indonesia, but also international perceptions of the nature of Islam in Indonesia. Islam in Indonesia is still overwhelmingly extraordinarily tolerant, extraordinarily moderate, and very open. But you wouldn't know it reading the newspapers, not just internationally, but in Indonesia as well.
I wanted to talk to you about that. The Indonesian press is genuinely free to report as it pleases, but there's some who say that it's this very freedom that's given rise to the erosion of other civil liberties. How is that possible?
Well, again, this goes back to my earlier comments that to understand what's happening after Suharto, you have to know what happened beforehand. And it was with the removal of restrictions on the Muslim expression of identity, plus at the same time very tight restrictions on the press and the media, that you've got this sort of combination that's been exploited brilliantly by these conservative groups. Suddenly they were free to express their views, even quite extreme views, and they had an open media that was able to report them. And in fact, militant Islamist groups who are agitating right through the Suharto period, often with quite severe consequences, are much more experienced at this sort of thing than more moderate liberal groups. The more moderate liberal groups really only started to win an audience after Suharto fell from power. So I think they started their activism a little bit too late. By then, key ideas, key themes of the militants had already captured the public imagination. A sense of moral panic has been the key weapon of the militant conservatives on issues such as sexuality, the role of women, pornography, things that people find it hard to disagree about. You know, pornography should be banned, women should be more modest, people should comply with sexual orthodoxy as they see it. people say yes to this, and this has been used very well as a vehicle for the Conservatives to create this sense of moral panic and to dominate the public agenda over Islam with issues about sex, women's place in society and so forth. This has left the Liberals playing catch-up and in a very difficult position of trying to justify a position that forces them to a corner saying pornography is okay and so forth.
Now, I'd like you to talk a little to how this has impacted on women's lives and what's being done about it.
I think probably the best example of this is the anti-pornography law number 44 of 2008. This took almost a decade to get it through the legislature. The anti-pornography law is really, in many respects, an anti-woman law. What it does is criminalise much sexuality, tightly censors the arts and the media. It prohibits a lot of traditional cultural expression involving nudity and the body. It forces women to cover up if it was to be applied, thus excluding them from public space. And it's also a version writ large of local regulations that have been passed in the post-Suharto period right across Indonesia in areas where the Conservatives are strong. The debate over this law was intense. It led to demonstrations, thousands of people, Muslims mainly, marching for and against the pornography legislation. It perfectly exemplified this division in the way this is an argument within Islam about its future. And it led to various non-Muslim parts of Indonesia threatening to secede Bali, Papua and elsewhere if the law was passed. It was passed and it does exist and represents a success for the militant conservative Islamists. And in the background behind this, we've got a whole range of prosecutions under equivalent laws now at the local area. You have issues such as a factory worker, a woman being arrested late at night despite being pregnant, essentially because she had lipstick in her handbag, and being charged and convicted of prostitution. Cases such as that where women in public space are targeted by the Conservatives. It ties into this notion of the persecution of vulnerable groups by the Conservatives, whether they are religious minorities or whether they are seen as vulnerable groups such as women in the community. And this, of course, brings the whole issue of human rights to a head. One of the great achievements of the post-Suharto democratisation process was the introduction of human rights, not just in the Constitution with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but a whole raft of laws introduced and new organisations and bodies set up to implement it. We had, for example, a Women's Human Rights Commission. There are commissions for the rights of the child and so forth. So that aspect of civil society is now confronted with the Muslim conservative aspects of civil society, and they are fighting over it. And so on the Women's Human Rights Commission, the Komnas Perempuan, you find some of the commissioners there are leading Muslim intellectuals who are facing off against hardline Islamist Muslim intellectuals on the other side over what's to come.
As you say, it's a fight for the future of Islam within Indonesia. Tim, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
We've been speaking with Professor Tim Lindsey, the Director of the Asian Law Centre here at the University of Melbourne, and Dr. M. Syafi'i Anwar, the Director of the International Centre for Islam and Pluralism. And we've been talking about the threats to pluralism in Indonesia. Relevant links, a full transcript and more info on this episode can be found at our website at upclose.unimelb.edu.au. Up Close is a production of the University of Melbourne, Australia. This episode was recorded on April the 5th, 2011, and our producers were Eric Van Bemmel and Calvin Parham. Audio engineering by Gavin Neighbour. Up Close is created by Calvin Parham and Eric Van Bemmel. I'm Jennifer Cook. Until next time, goodbye.
You've been listening to Up Close. For more information, visit upclose.unimelb.edu.au. Copyright 2011, The University of Melbourne.